The evening sky wore a shawl of rust and violet, the kind of color that comes when the sun slips low and the land exhales its heat. Across the wide and wind-brushed plains sat a ranch that had seen better days. Its fences leaned with weary bones, its roof sagged as though bowing under years of sorrow, and its pasture was no more than brittle stalks waving like forgotten graves. Cattle, what few remained, stood thin and tired in the fading light, ribs like shadows against their hides. This was where Elias lived. He was not an old man, though life had carved lines across his face like rivers drying in the dust. Hardship has a way of painting years onto a body quicker than time alone. His hands, thick and scarred, told of countless hours binding rope, hauling feed, mending breaks in a world that never seemed to stop breaking. His boots carried dust from the same trail, walked 1,000 times. His eyes, pale and thoughtful, looked as if they held storms that never fully came. He was poor, not just in coin or cattle, but in company. For loneliness is the heaviest poverty. Yet he was not alone. By his side, always by his side, padded a dog named Boone. Boone was a shepherd mix, broad-shouldered, coat thick with dust and burrs from long days on the prairie. His ears tipped forward at every sound, and his gaze carried the steady patience of an animal who knows more than it speaks. Where Elias walked, Boone followed. Where Boone barked, Elias listened. In truth, it was Boone who had kept Elias tethered to life. There were nights when the fire burned low, when hunger gnawed and debts grew sharper than wolves, when Elias wondered what use there was in going on. Yet each time, Boone would nudge his hand, press close, and breathe warmth against his palm. In that simple loyalty, Elias found reason. One doesn't give up when something still believes in them. The ranch was failing. Neighbors whispered, some with pity, others with mockery. A man with no herd was no man at all in those parts. But Elias, stubborn in a quiet way, endured. He rose before dawn, worked until the stars spread silver dust across the sky, and returned to the cabin where Boone waited by the door. There he would share what little bread he had, half for himself, half for the dog, always with the gentleness of a father feeding his child. Nights were long and still. The wind would crawl across the plains like an old hymn, rattling shutters, carrying with it the smell of dry earth and cedar smoke. Elias would sit in his chair, Boone at his feet, watching the flames dance inside the stove. He often thought the fire looked freer than he ever felt, leaping wild in its short life, while he remained bound to debt and duty. Still, there was comfort in Boone's steady breathing, in knowing someone listened when silence pressed too heavy. Boone was not like other dogs. He had a way of sensing storms before clouds gathered, danger before a snake moved in the grass. Sometimes he would stare at Elias as though searching his soul, and Elias would look back, feeling as if Boone knew things he himself had forgotten. Some said animals had a second sight. Elias didn't know about that. He only knew Boone had saved him from more than loneliness, once from a rattler's strike, once from drifting into despair too deep. It was Boone who led Elias to the woods that evening. The woods stood at the far edge of his land, though truth be told Elias had not set foot in them for years. They belonged to old stories, whispers of outlaws, and forgotten feuds. Children were warned to keep out, and men said the ground hid more than roots. But Boone did not heed such tales. Dogs know nothing of men's fears. That day had been harder than most. A cow lay sick, another gone missing. Elias had patched another fence with wood too thin to hold long. As dusk fell, he leaned against the rail, hat low, weary beyond words. Boone suddenly lifted his head, ears sharp. He gave a low bark, deep and urgent, then bounded toward the line of trees. Elias called out, voice tired, but Boone didn't turn. The dog slipped through the tall grass, tail high, vanishing into shadow. For a moment, Elias thought to let him go. It was dangerous ground, after all, and he had little strength left. But the silence that followed cut deep. He could not bear the thought of losing Boone. Not him, not the only soul who'd stayed. So with a sigh heavier than his boots, Elias followed. The woods swallowed him slowly. Trees rose close, their branches knitting overhead until the last of the sunset bled away. The air was cool, thick with pine and damp soil, a different world than the open plains. Every twig snap echoed like a secret spoken too loud. Boone's barks guided him deeper, each one more insistent. Elias came upon a clearing where the earth looked unsettled, as though it had been disturbed long ago and never smoothed. Boone stood over it, paws scratching, nose pressed to the soil. He whined, looking back at Elias, then pawed again, dirt spraying in small bursts. Something was buried there. Elias froze, heart knocking in his chest. His mind ran through possibilities, some animal's cache, an outlaw's stash, or worse, a grave. He gripped his shovel, though he hadn't brought one. His hands itched, wanting to dig, yet fear rooted him. The woods were heavy with silence, save for Boone's breathing. Elias crouched, running his fingers over the soft mound of earth. Beneath the dirt he felt something hard, wood, perhaps, or stone. His pulse quickened, but he pulled back. Not tonight, he murmured, voice barely more than breath. His eyes lifted to the dark canopy above, stars trying to pierce through. He covered the soil Boone had disturbed, patting it flat with careful hands. Boone whined, reluctant, but obeyed when Elias stood. Some discoveries wait for the heart to be ready. They walked back together, man and dog, shadows stretched long in the moonlight. Boone padded close, as though knowing secrets take time. Elias glanced over his shoulder once more at the dark woods, a chill crawling up his spine. The ground had spoken, but it would speak again when it was meant to, and so they returned to the cabin, the fire still glowing faint within. Elias sat in his chair, Boone at his feet, staring into the flames as if they could tell him what lay hidden beneath that mound. Sleep would not come easy, for once a man touches mystery, it never leaves him in peace. The plains outside sighed with the night wind, carrying with it the hush of untold things. Boone dreamed, paws twitching, chasing something unseen. Elias closed his eyes but saw only earth waiting. The earth holds more than roots. It holds silence. It holds secrets. And sometimes, when a man least expects it, it presses those secrets up toward the surface, the way spring water rises after a drought. Elias could not sleep after that night in the woods. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Boone scratching at the soil, heard the soft scrape of claws against something solid. He tried to push it from his mind, telling himself it was nothing more than old lumber, maybe a hunter's forgotten pit. But the heart knows when it has brushed against destiny. He worked his ranch as always, repairing, hauling, counting the thin cattle as though numbers might grow if he willed them hard enough. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He carried the weight of something unseen, like a man who has been told a secret and cannot decide whether it is gift or curse. Boone seemed restless too, often pacing at the edge of the pasture, ears cocked toward the woods, as if the earth itself was calling him back. The townsfolk noticed Elias moving slower, his eyes distant. They whispered, as people in small places always do. Some said he had grown weary. Others said he was finally losing his mind after years of solitude. The truth was softer, stranger. He had brushed against buried things, and such encounters change a man. It was in those quiet days that memories began to stir, old and sharp as glass. There had been a woman once, Clara. She had hair the color of wheat at harvest and a laugh that could loosen the tightest knot in a man's chest. Elias had loved her from afar for many years, the kind of love that grows steady and unspoken, like water wearing down stone. But in the world of cattle and coin, love is often measured in acres, not in kindness. And Elias had so little to offer. Clara chose another, a man with deep pockets and a wide ranch, who wore fine boots and spoke with confidence like thunder across a valley. Elias did not blame her. He knew the world was cruel to women who married for love alone. Still, the loss cut deep, a wound that never closed, only scarred. He had carried it with quiet dignity, pouring his affection instead into Boone, into the brittle land, into the silence of long nights. The years passed, and the ranch shrank, debts grew, yet Elias never sought another heart. He had given his once, and it had not been returned. That, too, was buried in him. The town itself was a rough sort of place, balanced between dust and survival. There was Sheriff Grady, a man fair enough in law, but quick to judge Elias as weak. Grady often said the poor rancher would be swallowed whole by his own land. Elias never argued. He saved his words, for words cost nothing and yet still seemed too dear. There was Martha, a widow who lived near the chapel. She was kind, with hands that still baked bread for neighbors though her own cupboards were thin. She would sometimes leave a loaf at Elias's door, wrapped in cloth. He thanked her with quiet nods, but never lingered. People like Martha deserved better than the shadow he carried. And there was Jeb Rollins, rival rancher, full of swagger and bitterness. Jeb saw Elias as a fool clinging to dead dreams, and he never missed a chance to remind him. A man like Jeb was made of hunger, not the hunger of empty stomachs, but of greed that no meal could fill. Elias bore it all with silence. Yet Boone saw everything, his eyes sharp, his body tense when Jeb drew near. Boone, more than anyone, knew Elias's worth. It was Boone again who led him back to the woods. Days had passed since that first discovery. Elias had avoided the trees, fearing not the place itself, but what it demanded of him. Still, Boone returned each evening to the edge of pasture, barking toward the shadows, then looking back at Elias with urgency. On the fourth night, when the moon lay thin as a silver coin, Elias finally followed. The woods welcomed him with cool breath. He carried a lantern this time, its glow swaying, painting gold on bark and shadow. Boone padded ahead, sure-footed, tail stiff with focus. They reached the clearing, the disturbed earth waiting like an unhealed wound. Boone pawed again, whining low, and Elias felt his chest tighten. He dropped to his knees and scraped at the soil with his hands. The earth gave way, soft and damp, until his fingers struck something hard. Wood. He dug faster, the lantern flickering against his anxious face. Soon the outline of a chest appeared, edges worn, the color of old bones. Iron hinges caught the light, rusted but intact. Elias's breath hitched. It was real, not a trick of the eye, not some animal's den. A chest buried long ago. He pulled at it, but it would not lift. It was heavy, too heavy. His strength, already worn thin from days of labor, faltered. Sweat dripped down his brow. Boone whined, circling, nose pressed to the ground as if urging him onward. Elias sat back, panting, heart hammering in his ears. Fear crept in. What if it belonged to outlaws, their ghosts still watching? What if opening it brought ruin rather than fortune? The world had never handed Elias gifts without cost. Why would it start now? His lantern sputtered, and in that dim light, his doubts grew larger. With trembling hands, Elias began to cover the chest again, pressing the soil back, hiding what he had uncovered. Boone barked, sharp and protesting, but Elias only shook his head. Not yet, old friend, not yet. He stood, his knees aching, and looked out into the black spread of woods. Some secrets, he told himself, need their time. Maybe the earth wasn't finished with its silence. Maybe he wasn't ready to carry what lay beneath. Together they walked back to the ranch, lantern fading, Boone at his side though reluctant. Elias's shoulders sagged under a weight heavier than any debt, heavier even than loneliness. For once a man has touched the edge of mystery, he carries it whether or not he claims it. That night he sat long before the fire, staring into its restless dance. Boone lay close, eyes open, as if guarding more than his master. Elias whispered into the dark, words meant for no one and everything at once. If the earth holds such things, what else does it keep from us? The flames answered only with crackle and smoke. Storms have a way of stirring things the earth keeps buried. They roll in fierce and uninvited, tearing across the plains as if to remind men that nothing is ever truly theirs. The sky cracks open, the wind screams, and in the chaos, old secrets come loose. It was under such a storm that Elias returned to the woods. The day had begun with heavy clouds crouched low, and by nightfall the heavens split wide. Rain lashed the roof of the cabin, and Boone paced by the door, restless, nose pressed to the crack where water seeped in. Elias sat in his chair, hat low, staring at the fire that struggled against the drafts. He could not still his hands. They twitched, knuckles white against the chair's arms, as though the storm outside had found its twin inside him. When Boone barked sharp, urgent, Elias rose without a word. He grabbed the lantern, the old shovel he had leaned near the door for days, and stepped into the night. Boone darted ahead through the rain, tail streaking like a flag in the dark. The woods swallowed them quick, branches dripping, the path slick with mud. The lantern's glow wavered, a fragile star in a world drowned in shadow. Elias's boots sank deep, water seeping in, but still he pressed on. Boone's barks led him sure and steady to the clearing, where the earth waited like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Elias fell to his knees. The rain softened the ground, making the digging easier, though the mud clung heavy. He thrust the shovel deep, throwing clumps aside, each stroke driving his breath ragged. Boone stayed near, circling, growling low at the shadows between trees as though guarding his master from unseen eyes. At last, the wood appeared, darkened, swollen with age. Elias scraped mud away with trembling fingers, revealing iron edges corroded but whole. The chest sat heavy, half-buried still, but he managed to lever it free with the shovel. It rose from the ground like a thing reluctant to leave its grave. For a long moment he just stared, rain running down his face, mixing with the sweat and the dirt. His chest heaved, his heart beat wild as the storm. He pulled at the latch. Rust resisted, but it gave with a groan, and the lid creaked open. Lantern light spilled over what lay inside. Gold coins dulled by years, but gleaming still. Bars stamped with old marks, heavy and solid. Jewels tucked in velvet pouches that had long since rotted through. A fortune beyond anything Elias had ever dreamed. More wealth than his neighbors combined, enough to buy not only freedom from debt, but a kingdom of land and cattle. The air seemed to thicken. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He reached in, let a coin roll between his fingers, heavy, undeniable. He could feel his life shifting with its weight. But with the wonder came fear. He thought of Jeb Rollins, greedy eyes always watching. He thought of Sheriff Grady, too quick to judge. He thought of Clara, who had chosen wealth once before. What would they do if they knew? What would he become if he let this gold decide his worth? The storm raged on, and Elias sat with the chest open before him, Boone pressed close against his knee. The dog's steady presence anchored him. Boone didn't see gold or jewels, only his master, the man he had followed through hunger and sorrow. In Boone's eyes there was no change. Elias was still Elias. The realization cut deep. Wealth could blind others, but Boone saw true. He closed the lid with a heavy hand, heart pounding with the decision he knew would not be simple. He carried the chest back, straining under its weight, stumbling through mud and rain. Boone trotted beside him, never wavering. By the time he reached the cabin, dawn's first gray light had begun to stretch over the horizon. Elias dragged the chest into the barn, covering it with sacks and straw. He leaned against the wall, chest heaving, muscles aching. The treasure was his now, yet it felt less like a gift and more like a burden. Days passed, and Elias lived with the secret. He worked as before, though his hands shook when he held the reins, his mind always circling back to what lay hidden under straw. Boone seemed uneasy, watching the barn, growling softly at strangers who came near. Elias's sleep grew thin, dreams filled with coins spilling like rivers, faces twisted with greed. And then, as if summoned by fate, a stranger appeared. He rode in quiet, not like the brash cowhands who thundered through town. His horse was lean, his clothes simple, his hat low. He asked for water, for directions, nothing more. His voice was calm, respectful, carrying no hunger. When he looked at Elias, it was not with pity nor suspicion, but with recognition, as though he saw the man beneath the dust. They spoke only briefly. The stranger introduced himself as Thomas, a drifter heading west, searching for land where he might settle quiet. He did not pry, did not boast. Boone, usually wary, accepted him with a wag of the tail. That alone told Elias something true. For the first time in years, Elias felt the stirrings of trust. But the secret in the barn weighed heavier each day. It seemed to pulse through the walls, calling to anyone who passed. Neighbors began to glance longer at Elias when he came into town, whispers running like creek water. Jeb Rollins in particular watched him with narrowed eyes, sensing change, though he could not name it. Elias knew the storm had not ended. It had only shifted shape. One evening, as he sat by the fire, Boone asleep at his feet, Elias thought of Clara. He had seen her in town recently, her face thinner, her laugh gone. The man she had married, the one with acres and coin, had turned bitter, cruel in his ways. Clara's eyes had found Elias once across the street, a flicker of regret there, or perhaps longing for what might have been. Wealth had not brought her joy. It had chained her, the way it now threatened to chain him. Elias leaned forward, hand resting on Boone's back, voice low as a prayer. Gold don't measure a man, nor love, nor peace. The flames whispered back with their soft crackle, as though they agreed. Yet even as he spoke the words, the barn seemed to sigh with the weight of buried things, waiting for the moment when the secret would no longer stay hidden. Morning came thin and pale, the kind of light that does not warm so much as reveal. Elias rose early, though he had barely slept, and stepped out into a world that seemed to hold its breath. Boone padded beside him, tail brushing against his master's leg, eyes sharp toward the barn. The chest lay hidden under sacks of straw, yet Elias could feel its pull, as though the earth itself whispered of what he had unearthed. It is a strange thing how secrets leak, not through words alone, but through the way a man carries himself. Elias walked heavier now, shoulders burdened with something unseen, and in small towns, such changes do not go unnoticed. By the week's end, whispers had gathered like tumbleweeds in the wind. Sheriff Grady rode by twice, tipping his hat, his gaze lingering longer than before. Martha left another loaf at his door, eyes kind but searching, as though she sensed Elias wrestled with something larger than hunger. And Jeb Rollins, ever the wolf sniffing for weakness, watched him from across the street in town, suspicion sharpening into hunger. Elias avoided their eyes. He worked his ranch, fed his cattle, mended fences, yet all the while the weight of the chest pressed against him, heavier than any debt had ever been. Clara appeared one afternoon. She stood at his gate, her dress plain, her hands clasped tight, as though she feared they might tremble if she let them loose. Boone barked once, then quieted, tail low, sensing her sorrow. Elias walked to her slowly, hat in hand. Her voice was soft, the years worn into it like creases in fabric. "I came to see if you were well." He nodded, unable to find words. Her eyes held a sadness he recognized, the kind that comes when dreams chosen turn to chains. She glanced at the cabin, the barn, then back at him. For a moment the air between them carried what once had been, and what might still be, if courage allowed. But before Elias could speak, Boone growled low. Jeb Rollins was near. That night, under a sliver of moon, Elias caught movement at the edge of his land. Boone barked fierce, teeth bared, and Elias took his rifle, stepping into the cool dark. Jeb stood by the barn, lantern in hand, eyes glinting like a man who had sniffed out blood. "So it's true," Jeb sneered. "You found yourself fortune buried under your dirt. No wonder you've been walking like a man with fire in his pocket." Elias's stomach dropped. He had never spoken of the chest. But greed has its own kind of sense, sharp as any hound. Jeb stepped closer, hand resting on his gun. "You ain't fit for riches, Elias. You squander land, let cattle die, live like a beggar. That chest'll do more good in my hands." Boone growled deep, fur bristling, but Elias held him back with a hand. His voice came low, steady as he could manage. "It ain't yours, Jeb. Leave it be. But greed is deaf." Jeb shoved past, storming toward the barn. Elias followed fast, Boone lunging at his side. Inside the barn, Jeb kicked aside straw, exposing the chest. His lantern light caught the glint of iron, and his face twisted with wild hunger. He bent to lift it, but Boone sprang. The dog's teeth sank into Jeb's arm, tearing a cry from him. The lantern fell, rolling, its flame catching dry straw. fire leapt up, wild and hungry. Chaos filled the barn, the crackle of flames, Jeb's curses, Boone snarls, Elias shouting. Elias grabbed Boone, pulling him back, while Jeb drew his pistol, rage in his eyes. For a heartbeat, the world froze. The fire blazing, Boone baring his teeth, Elias's rifle in hand. Then Elias spoke, his voice low but ringing true above the flames. "This gold ain't worth a man's soul, Jeb, and it won't take mine." He lowered his rifle. Jeb, bleeding, coughing in smoke, stared at Elias as though seeing a stranger. He stumbled, dropped his pistol, and fled into the night, clutching his arm, swallowed by the dark. Elias dragged the chest from the barn as fire licked higher, Boone straining beside him. They heaved it into the dirt outside, coughing, eyes burning. The barn collapsed behind them in sparks and ash, the night alive with ruin. Elias stared at the chest, its iron edges glowing red in the fire's light. Boone pressed close, trembling, loyal as ever. And in that moment, Elias knew what must be done. At dawn, when the fire had burned itself to embers, Elias took the chest back into the woods. Boone padded beside him, silent, as though he understood. They returned to the clearing, the soil still soft, the storm's memory lingering in the air. Elias dug deep, hands blistered, sweat mixing with ash and soot. He lowered the chest into the earth, covering it once more, pressing the soil firm, as if sealing away not just gold but the burden it carried. When it was done, he sat back, Boone resting against him. He felt lighter than he had in years. The treasure had not saved him, but had shown him truth, that wealth measured in coin could never match the riches of loyalty, mercy, and peace. The days that followed carried a strange calm. Word spread that Jeb had been burned in a barn fight, though Elias never spoke of treasure. Sheriff Grady asked questions, but found no proof. Martha brought another loaf, smiling gently at Elias's thanks. And Clara returned once more, this time without fear in her eyes. They walked the fields together, the silence between them no longer heavy but kind. She told him she was leaving her loveless life behind. He listened, heart quiet but warm, and Boone walked at their side, tail swaying like a banner of homecoming. Elias was no longer rich in the way the world counted. His ranch was still small, his herd still thin. But he was not poor. Not anymore. At night, by the fire, Clara near, Boone asleep at his feet, Elias felt wealth deeper than gold could ever give. Peace had returned to his heart, and the earth, once again, kept its secrets. Some treasures are meant to stay buried. Some treasures live in the open, in loyalty, in mercy, in love that waits through years of silence. And so, friends, remember this when the world tells you riches are measured in coin. A man may strike gold and still be empty, but a man who finds kindness, who chooses love, who spares when he might destroy, such a man is never poor. I thank you for sitting by this firelight tale, letting it warm your chest for a while. If this story found a place in your heart, let it linger like smoke after the embers fade. Tell me, from where do you listen to these Wild West nights? Share your thoughts. And if you wish to ride along for more such stories, do like, comment, and subscribe so this old voice may keep speaking to you across the miles.